Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Happy Monday, sir.
Well, very good. We have a special guest and a friend on our program today, Justin Pavoni, who is a former Air Force flight pilot who has seen active duty. And Justin, I want to welcome you to the program.
Thanks for having me back, Dr. Paul. Happy Thanksgiving, guys.
Well, very good. Thank you. First off, I wanted to thank you and your wife, Jessica, not only for your, everybody gets thanks for their service, including myself when I've been in the military. Thank you for your service, which sometimes is offensive, but we want to thank you for your service to promote the cause of liberty. And we also want to thank both of you for being strong supporters for the Institute of Peace and Prosperity, of course, the organization that Daniel is the executive director, so support like that to us is very important. But before we get into the question about a recent article you wrote, I wanted to ask you a little bit because you ally yourself with we who call ourselves libertarians, and quite frankly, I don't understand exactly when you became a libertarian, or you used that term. Was it your experience in the military specifically, or was it something that you had heard about when you were still, in the military, before you went to the military? How did that come about?
Right, so my wife actually wrote an article about this called Ron Paul, the Gateway Drug. And for us, in particular, it was foreign policy, but we were in Afghanistan and we were listening to you on the 2012 debates. And pretty much everything you were saying with regards to the wars was really ringing true with our experience over there. And, that was the initial subject, foreign policy and the issue of peace versus war and self-defense versus aggression that really got us to go down the rabbit hole. I was already sort of a free enterprise supporter, but the whole ideology of libertarianism as a whole kind of came together once we heard you in those debates and then started doing some research on our own.
Well, a lot of people have thought along your terms of what you've gone through, but Daniel has a question more specifically on something that you've done recently for the Institute.
Yeah, Justin, you wrote a really interesting article a few days ago. It was originally on antiwar.com, but we picked it up at the Ron Paul Institute as well, and it was about conscientious objection, and it almost is kind of a quaint term, or brings back the 60s, and I think a lot of people don't talk about it, but you bring it up in a whole new light, and you talk about some of the trials and tribulations that you had trying to get out of the military as a conscientious objector. Could you give us a little background there and what it means, and also what it means today especially?
Sure. So conscientious objection was a lot more well-known and popular in the 70s or late 60s when the Vietnam War was going on and the U.S. was using a draft to provide personnel for the military. Obviously, when you're being coerced into the military, it creates a lot more resistance out of the population. So one of the avenues for people to get out of military service that didn't want to fight in a war was conscientious objection, and that's basically a moral opposition to all war. People today in the voluntary military think that conscientious objection isn't really applicable anymore. That's not the case. When you go into the military, you sign a piece of paper that basically says you're not a conscientious objector. But, for people like myself, I had a life experience where I changed my opinion about my moral beliefs and what we were doing while I was in the military. And so there is an avenue to get out of the military as a conscientious objector, assuming that your beliefs changed while you were actually in the service. So it's still a very relevant issue, more so for people that are actually in the military themselves, rather than for people that aren't forced to become a part of the military just as normal civilians.
We made a great point in the article that I, to be honest, hadn't really thought that much of, and it is the difference between a conscientious objection and what you like to point out is much preferable, the idea of a selective objection. Could you fill us in on the difference between those two?
Right, so selective objection is basically the opposition to this war. Like, I think the Iraq war is wrong, or I think that the Syrian war is wrong. Conscientious objection is more of a philosophical opposition to all war at all times, no matter what. And a lot of people have a little bit of an aversion to the idea of being against all wars at all times, because most of us recognize the inherent right of people to defend themselves. And so, they think that because you would conscientiously object to all wars, you don't think that it's okay to defend themselves, and it's sort of doesn't make logical sense with a lot of people. that's why selective objection, I think, is so important, because most people sort of think of the theoretical possibility of a just war happening as a reason to dismiss conscientious objection, but they might be opposed to any one particular war as like an aggressive war, an immoral war. And I think it's really important to give people the freedom of conscience to act in the particular situation that they're faced with, on their conscience. If you think the Vietnam War is wrong, you shouldn't have to participate. You certainly don't want to be coerced into, violence against your fellow man if you have nothing against them. It's not a good thing for society. And the same goes with, the wars of today.
Justin, on the internet, and I think it occurred after we talked before, there was some serious, thought-out criticisms of our position, and especially yours, and they were saying, well, Justin, you signed up, you signed your contract, and now you want to separate yourself from this contract. Have you had that directed at you where you've actually given an answer to that? Do you want to comment on that challenge?
Yeah, sure. So I definitely have gotten a lot of criticism about that. I have two things to say about it. Number one, I don't think it's whatsoever opting out of your contract. It's a totally legal loophole in the contract that says if you think that this war is immoral, you don't have to participate. You can, as part of a normal administrative application, apply for conscientious objection. If you get accepted, they can let you out scot-free. It's just part of the rules of the military. So there's nothing below board whatsoever with the process. The other thing I think on a larger picture, though, is, even if that weren't the case, I think both parties are subject to the contract. So the government can be defunct in its obligation to the soldier just as much as the soldier can be defunct in its obligation to the government. And I think soldiers have an obligation to interpret not only the legality and the constitutionality of wars, but also, more importantly, the morality of a war, and to stand for all of the above, but most importantly, the moral principles, of self-defense and non-aggression above and beyond whatever else may, may be considered.
Yeah, I think this is important, and you touched on the point that I think is a powerful point. Matter of fact, the first point, that you are following a legal procedure, is something that I wasn't aware of before, and I think that's very important for a lot of people. But the other thing is once you're in the military, there could be easy assumption, especially if you're 18 or 19-year-old, where so many people join, that our government will do the right thing and they're going to obey the laws and not do anything illegal or unconstitutional. Once you get involved, the war may morph into something else. It may be that they start off in a real restrained manner. You join the military to defend the country, and all of a sudden you find out that the Army that you joined, or the Air Force you've joined, has all of a sudden morphed into something that is totally unconstitutional. I would think it would be easy for us to charge the government with breaking a contract, if anybody.
Right, so I totally agree with everything you just said, and in fact, that mirrored my own personal experience a lot. I joined after 9/11 thinking that our country got attacked, that I wanted to legitimately defend our country from people who were aggressively acting against it. And as it turns out, what we're essentially doing overseas is assassinating a bunch of so-called terrorists without trial, without charge, in any country of our choosing, basically with no rule of law, with no transparency, no declaration, and no constrained categorization of who in fact could be or is a terrorist, whether it's an American citizen or a foreigner, this country or that country. And it's morphed into something that is essentially a recipe for breeding terrorism rather than a mechanism to defend against the very thing that got us started in it.
Now, Justin, you mentioned in your article that in your experience there are a great many very thoughtful people in the military who entertain some of the doubts that you have about American foreign policy and the direction. They're sitting there, they're thinking these thoughts that you had thought at one point. What would you say to them right now, given your experience in getting out, if they're having the same thoughts as you were?
Well, I think like you guys mentioned, a lot of people have stereotypes about their commitment, and a lot of people, myself included, want to, do what they've said they're going to do, and that's a big barrier to leaving the military. People feel very trapped by their so-called contractual obligation, and I think dispelling the, wrong assumptions about that are important. For one, I just lost my train of thought there a little bit, guys, but do you mind getting me back?
Yeah, what would you say to someone who might be watching the show who's having the same thoughts that you had?
Yeah, I think people need encouragement. If you feel like what is happening overseas is wrong, if it's morally wrong, I think you have an obligation to, first of all, even if it's legal, disregard the legality. I think that the wars are blatantly illegal. You don't have the authority in the Constitution, and international law certainly doesn't allow you to aggressively invade countries and overthrow their governments. That's not legal in any sense of the word. But even if it was, you have a moral obligation to yourself and your conscience, and I think we need to encourage these people to act on their consciences. And, if you're one of the minority, or perhaps, a much larger minority than people think, who think the wars are wrong, I would encourage you to, to leave or do what you can to not participate and opt out peacefully. There are a lot of supporting agencies out there. Our friend, who I hope you have on, Maria Santelli at the Center on Conscience and War, is a really great resource for GIs that are struggling with, the morality of what their government is forcing them to do. And I think you can look into that and many other resources out there.
Justin, frequently when I've been on college campuses talking about foreign policy and economic policies, and a lot of young people will get excited and they say, boy, your philosophy makes a lot of common sense. And then they'll say, what should I do? What should I do? And, I sort of give a sort of a flippant answer. I said, do whatever you want to do. It's like everybody has an obligation. There's no set pattern. And I would say that's exactly what you did. You did something under the circumstances that you thought was morally correct, and you felt good about your decision. And in a way, it contradicts the conclusion of a song that I use in my book, Swords into Plowshares, the Universal Soldiers, saying that it's an anti-war song, but it says that, there would be no wars if we didn't have the universal soldier who always went to war and they never could stand up. And I sort of conclude that there is a chance that we could become the only resistance to war, because governments notoriously always start the war. So if we could attack this, and I think this is exactly what you're doing, you're saying that if you don't have the soldiers to drop the bombs and shoot the guns, of course you would still have the wars, but they would only be defensive wars if you could ever get to do it. And I think this, what you're doing is fantastic. It's a personal responsibility. It's a moral judgment. It fits into our Constitution. And I just think that you're sort of dispelling this notion that forever and ever we'll have the universal soldier, and they've been around for thousands of years, but there's no reason why we can't challenge the status quo of anything. And I think that's what our job right now, and I think what you're doing is great.
Justin, as I was preparing for the show, I was thinking about a very memorable moment in the Foreign Affairs Committee when Dr. Paul was in Congress, and he was arguing against going to war with Iraq. And he said, why are we going to go? They don't attack us. They haven't attacked us. And you mentioned this in your article. They haven't attacked us. Why do they want us to go to war? And one member said to him, well, of course they're attacking us. They're shooting at our planes as we're bombing them. So that was the justification that they gave for the war.
It was in that same discussion that the chairman of the board, when I insisted they vote on an up or down vote on declaration of war, which I told him I'd of course vote against, he said, well, that part of the Constitution is an anachronism. And I thought, oh boy, this is what we're facing. But we don't have to face that constantly. We're going to change all that. Justin, I want to thank you very much for once again visiting with us. I think it's very important that more people hear your story.
Well, thank you guys both very much for having me on. I appreciate it, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Okay. I want to thank our audience for tuning in today. This is a very important subject because it has to do with war and peace and moral responsibility of the individual. I don't believe in collectivism for rights or punishments, and actually ideas are individual too, but ideas spread and larger numbers endorse those. So when the ideas of peace spread, we will have peace. Right now, we're facing a tremendous barrage of false stories and propaganda going on, with ISIS and other things as if the world is going to end tomorrow, and it's all based on falsehoods. So this is the goal that we have, is to get the truth out. And of course, Daniel deserves a lot of credit with the Institute of Peace and Prosperity, because that is the goal, is to figure out how we can get a larger number of people who will act morally on their by themselves to resist the temptation of accepting war. And I was part of that, because when I was a young doctor and drafted in the Vietnam area, I wasn't ready to think about this or resist. I spent all my time studying medicine, and as a flight surgeon, I started to get an inkling of what was going on. But I think the whole purpose is to teach people that peace and prosperity comes from a moral principle of liberty for every individual. And though a lot of people talk about American exceptionalism, I'm not talking about that cliche that is used so carelessly. But there are some values that have been American values in the past that we need to not only restore but build on, because I think that nothing has been perfect in the past. It won't be perfect tomorrow, but there's no reason why we can't improve economic ideas as well as foreign policy idea, so that we can truly work for peace and prosperity. And I want to thank everybody today for tuning in, and please come back to the Liberty Report soon.